Oh, yeah, I'm Angela Collins again. I'm with Sea Grant and Manatee. Oh, really? Is that better? Can you hear me in the back? Still no? How's that? Better? Still good? Okay. Normally nobody has a problem hearing me. Okay, so if you can't hear me, just holler. But I am again with University of Florida and Florida Sea Grant, and I'm going to be presenting some work that I did over the past 5 or 6 years at Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWRI, on the central west coast of Florida. So Goliath Grouper are one of those species that are intimately linked with both nearshore and offshore habitats. They spend the juvenile portion of their life in mangrove habitat. They basically stay there until they can't fit those fat little bodies under those prop roots anymore, and then they gradually move offshore with maturity. They do form large spawning aggregations in deeper water. The spawning aggregations that have been identified to date have all been in that 120 to 140 foot range of depth. And then they have a pelagic larval phase that they float around in the ocean for about 35, 40 days until they end up back in estuarine habitat. Their center of abundance has always been the southwest coast of Florida. Historically, when there was a fishery for these guys, they were landed the most along the west coast of Florida. But their geographic range as a species is the South Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, down to the northern coast of South America, throughout the Caribbean. And then historically, there was a population along the west coast of Africa, but that nobody's seen a Goliath grouper over there for probably the past 30 years. So we think that that population's probably been completely extirpated at this point. Again, the historical center of abundance has always been southwest Florida as far as we can tell, and probably one of the main reasons for that is we have really extensive juvenile habitat along the southwest coast of Florida. And if you think about Florida today, I mean, really down here off the Everglades National Park and 10,000 Islands area, this is really one of the last remaining vast expanses of mangrove habitat in the state. So this continues to be a really important area for nursery for this fish. So they're large, they get really big, they live a long time. They don't mature until relatively late in life, typically somewhere between 4 and 6 years of age, and that corresponds to a total length of about 3 feet. So these guys have to get pretty big before they're able to mature. They're most likely sex changers, female first, and then if they decide to at some point in life, they can switch to male. The jury's still officially out on that, but it's a common reproductive characteristic in a lot of groupers, so it's a definite suspicion there. They are sedentary, so they have pretty strong site fidelity. They're not real big movers and shakers. They stay put for long periods of time, and they do form very predictable aggregations, and they seem to like high relief habitats. So that has made them relatively easy to locate. They also occur relatively shallow for a fish species. Typically, you don't find them much deeper than 140, 150 feet of water. So this makes them pretty accessible to people, and in fact, they were overfished pretty good through the 1980s, and in 1990 there was an emergency closure, and there's been a moratorium on the species ever since 1990 in the United States. However, the population has come back to a point that the National Marine Fisheries Service did remove them from the species of concern list in 2006. They do remain listed as critically endangered internationally on the IUCN Red List. So there's a little bit of conflicting perception, especially in the public, and conflicting pressure on regulators regarding the management of the species. Depending on who you talk to, some people believe that because they are critically endangered internationally, protection measures need to continue at the same strength and position that it currently is. But then some fishermen and people in areas where the population has rebounded significantly feel like the population can withstand some harvest. So depending on who you talk to, there's sometimes conflicting viewpoints on this species. We can talk a little bit more about that at any point later offline. So the current status of the stock, what we know today, is we definitely have seen increasing since protection measures were put into place in 1990. There is increasing juvenile abundance in nursery habitats. However, we have found that this species is susceptible to red tide events and cold kills. So if we have those sporadic natural events, you can have significant mortality within the population from red tide and cold temperatures. We do know for sure, talk to any fisherman on the west coast of Florida, adult numbers are increasing offshore as as compared to what they were a couple of decades ago. But the stock assessments that they've continued to perform keep failing, and it's pretty much because there's no fishery for this fish. So all those traditional data inputs that they put into the stock assessment models aren't there. We don't have landings data for this species. We don't have maximum age really for this species because the life history work that's been done on them was kind of done at the height of the overfishing for the animal. So they're missing some of these traditional pieces of information that are typical in the stock assessment process. So the estimates regarding population recovery are really kind of dependent upon directed research efforts. So we, wrote a small grant in 2006 to get some funding to sort of just look at habitat associations in a very defined and small geographic region. It was a NIMS-funded project, a cooperative research project. It started in 2007, and we wanted to just sort of identify or quantify habitat preferences of this fish in our area. So, this is the Tampa Bay region over here on the West Coast, and my lab was here. So we were basically surveying artificial and natural habitats throughout the year and counting the fish that we saw, quantifying the habitat characteristics, and visiting them at least on a quarterly basis. So we did over 500 surveys over, we're still actually doing surveys on some of the sites. But basically we did them year-round so we could identify seasonal patterns. And at each site we would assess how many Goliath were there, if they were present or absent, and size distribution as well, how many little ones, how many big ones, and we measured them via video camera. And then we'd also take really strong effort to characterize the habitat. We would only survey habitats that we could survey the entire site within our allowable bottom time. So we didn't pick really big, huge expanses of reef that we couldn't swim the whole thing within the time that we were allowed to stay on the bottom because we wanted to make sure we surveyed the whole area. We also measured them for their height and their volume, basically, especially with the artificial reefs. And then this is just kind of an example of how we measure fish. So you're just using a video camera. It has lasers on the top. They project equidistant points onto the animal. The animal needs to cooperate and get lateral to the camera, which isn't always, it's not always as easy right here. But anyway, you can take the image out of the video and then use an image analysis software and get measurements on your fish. So the reason we wanted to do that is because age can be proxied by size sometimes up to a certain point. So we could get an idea of sort of the age distribution of the fish that were on these reefs in our study area. So this is just an example of what it looks like when they're really cooperating. And this is really a rare picture, which is why I put it in every presentation, because he just laid there. We got him from every angle. He looks good from that side, right? So we also did some conventional and acoustic tagging. So I could probably talk about Goliath Grouper for a couple of days up here, so I'm just sort of giving you guys the cliff notes and highlights. But just so you know, we did put number was about 5 fish, even at our highest relief artificial reefs. Not to say that we don't see up to 25 fish and sometimes more than that. And then there is definitely a significant relationship to site volume. So as your volumes of your artificial reef gets greater, the number of fish that you can see these high volume sites, these big shipwrecks, on average have 10 fish every time you go all throughout the year. So those guys that say, hey, there's 10 fish on this site every time I go, I'm like, yeah, there is. You're right, there are. I mean, it's just that's the behavior that the fish has. So something that we wanted to look at a little bit more is residence time. Like, you go on the site, is that the same fish every time you go? Yeah, they have really strong residence and site fidelity. So we use our survey data that we've been collecting since 2007 to pick out some sites that we'd be pretty likely to catch Goliath Grouper on. So here's our initial survey area, and then we went from shallow, like in 30 feet of water, all the way out to reefs in 120 feet of water. Can everybody in the back still hear me okay? Okay. Okay, so we put acoustic receivers on 12 of these shipwrecks. And again, these are just little hydrophones that are continuously listening. So they're always listening for fish that have acoustic tags attached to them. And they're just permanently deployed out there. And we put up to 4 receivers on all of the shipwrecks that we had monitored. So basically, you just have all these little listening stations listening for anybody that's got a tag on them to swim within their range. Typically, at the deeper sites, these receivers have a range like 400 to 600 meters radius, so you can hear pretty far away from the receiver. And the Goliath Grouper definitely cooperated with catch and release angling. So with these tags, we actually wanted to make sure that we put them right where they were, because each one of those acoustic pingers cost $635. So they're pretty important to us that we put the tag on in the right spot. And another actually side note goal of this project was to look at catch and release mortality of this fish over different depths, but we won't talk about that today. But basically, we tagged 40 individuals at depths from 10 to 40 meters, so 30 to 125 feet, and they ranged in size from about 3 feet to about 6 feet. So we had a nice size range of fish. And they had residence times in residence time, by that I mean we detected that fish at that site this many days in a row. So we had residence times of anywhere from 18 to 736 days. And that's just basically the life of the tag. The tag just died, and I'm sure that fish is probably still visiting that site on a regular basis. So basically, these little pingers, you can see right there, it's attached to the dorsal part of the fish. And then they've also got their big ID tag, which is just a cattle ear tag. It's really nice for underwater visibility. You can see it from pretty far away. So this little pinger, basically every 1 to 3 minutes says, I'm here, this is my ID number, this is the time, this is the date, and this is my depth. So you can get this nice little information packet every 1 to 3 minutes. So think about these fish. If you guys have all seen Goliath Grouper underwater, we have an amazing data set, because some of these animals, we have almost 2 years of data. We have a depth position every 1 to 3 minutes for that fish for up to 2 years. So we got some really cool, like, gravy extra data that we can talk about another time. But basically, what the acoustic monitoring shows is that they do have very long stretches of presence at specific sites, and the site fidelity also increases their catchability. So it also actually adds to their vulnerability to overharvest. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about the fish. This graph is really busy, but it's my very favorite thing to show. I show it every time that I have a captive audience that has to listen to me talk. So this is basically 2 years of data smushed onto one graph, okay? So it's just kind of when we were doing the acoustic monitoring, and all these little numbers are the different Goliath groupers. And basically, the different symbols just indicate different artificial reefs that we were listening for them. And so basically what this is showing is they stay put for pretty long periods, but then they do leave sometimes. And their departures are, I'll get into that in a minute. So we had, again, total monitoring period, so basically where the first and last detection of a fish ranged anywhere from 18 to 950 days. But on average, we monitored these individuals for 444 days. That was our mean average monitoring period. 6 of the fish we recaptured. A couple of those 6 fish we recaptured a whole bunch of times, so they're obviously not learning from their catch and release experiences. They're taking the hook over and over again. And especially in our area, I don't know how it is up here, but they have a lot of face jewelry. I mean, they take the hooks. They are breaking off people's leaders. A lot of times you'll see Goliath with multiple hooks, dangling. Sometimes they'll be dragging lead weights, and they seem to, it doesn't seem to stop them from taking the hook again. 72% of our individuals went on what I called forays. They left their shipwreck, but then came right back home, if you want to call it that. They had definite homing to that site that they had initially been caught at. But we did see this really cool seasonal departure in the summertime, late summer, early fall, which corresponded with spawning season. We don't know where they went. We know where one went. But everybody else that left, if you check this out, you kind of see a whole bunch of these fish. And this, by the way, the departure was related to size, so we do think it was a reproductive thing. The biggest fish all left during spawning season, and all 3 years we had a coordinated sort of departure across the fish that we were listening to during their spawning season. So where are they going? We have to identify some more of the spawning sites in the Gulf of Mexico. But we do know where one of them went, and I'm going to tell you that story in a minute. So hang on, first I'm going to tell this story. Having all of these receivers within close proximity to each other let us get some really cool information on how the fish are moving around within the artificial reef array. They are definitely visiting other sites. Sometimes one of them will move, change residences, but a lot of times they just go, they visit another shipwreck, and then they come back. So they are moving back and forth between the artificial reefs, at least on a limited basis. And this is the cool fish. This guy was 6 feet in total length. We caught him at a wreck that was at 98 feet. Severe barotrauma. The stomach was averted. We had to vent the fish 6 or 7 times. I thought that it was a goner and we weren't going to get very much data from it, and it ended up being a complete rock star. It was tagged again at a shipwreck out in 100 feet of water. And we went down here, and just serendipitously, Chris Koenig with FSU had one single receiver in place on a shipwreck off Naples. That receiver just happened to be there and detect our Goliath Grouper for 2 weeks during the spawning season. And then this is where it gets even cooler. That was a 174-kilometer run for that fish. And then when he decided to go home after 2 weeks on that spawning site, he was back up here. We detected him on some of our southern shipwrecks. 160K in just 3 days. So that's pretty fast for somebody with that sort of body structure, right? Those chubby little guys can really move if they want to. So one of the other things that we started, actually, when I was with FWC, and now I'm with Sea Grant, so it's kind of cool. It came around, but Sea Grant approached me in 2010 and said, "Hey, we want to do more citizen science outreach stuff with the Goliath Grouper, and maybe involve people in recording it." So it started out as a Southwest Florida initiative. And again, it was a collaboration between Sea Grant and FWC, and then some volunteers that we had trained in the data collection method. And basically the idea of this count, so is everybody familiar with the Audubon bird count? It's basically that day around Christmas time when people go out and they count all the birds. Or the aerial surveys of the manatees, having this broad geographic region covered by a lot of people within a short time frame can sort of give you a snapshot idea of what's going on with Goliath Grouper abundance. And this data can become really valuable if you get a long-term data set. If you do it the same way for a long period of time, you go back to the same sites over a big geographic range. So it's interesting in that aspect and useful for management, but it also allows folks, outside of the scientific community to provide some of the information there. The fishermen and the divers are seeing these fish all the time, and they want to give you that information. So this provides an outlet and a way for people that are on the water all the time to incorporate some of their knowledge into the management process. So again, it's always the first week of June. We started it in 2010, so this year will mark the 8th consecutive year of the Great Goliath Grouper Count. We do have a standardized data collection procedure and a data sheet, and be it what it may, it's been, there's probably been some complaints about the way that it's formatted, but it's been the same way since we started, which kind of gives it some value there for analysis. We do focus at artificial reefs, and we do that because we know Goliath Grouper are going to be concentrating on the artificial reefs. So to date, there's been over 300 surveys. We averaged around 50 a year. And what started out as a Southwest Florida effort has really started to expand. So we're moving north, and that's why I'm here, to harass y'all for information. Actually, Mexico Beach Artificial Reef Association has been the lone Northwest Florida data provider. Actually, they were with us since 2010. They've been providing data, and they've continued to really provide some valuable stuff. And we do give the data to the stock assessment group. And in the last stock assessment, they did incorporate, they need 5 years of data in a row for it to be valuable in the stock assessment, I guess. So they were able to use our Great Goliath Grouper count data. The stock assessment failed, but they did incorporate the data that we gave them as one of the inputs into the whole process. It's not the only thing, thank goodness. There are a whole bunch of data inputs, but it is provided to management, so you can feel like your surveys are actually going somewhere. And this is just sort of a snapshot of, through time. It's missing a couple of years, but you can see, again, we started out down here. Mexico Beach isn't really on here yet, but we started, and that might have been because you guys weren't the first week of June that year. But on average, if you look at overall, the average number of fish per survey is still about 5 individuals on the artificial reefs. And again, we definitely see that the hot spot is down there in southwest Florida. But as the population continues to recover, the geographic range is definitely going to expand. They are going to be thermally limited. They don't like cold water. But I think that in the summertime especially, they're going to be more and more common up here in the northern Gulf. So we do need additional data from the northern Gulf. We do get anecdotal reports. Every once in a while, the guys in Louisiana will call and say, I saw one on this research site, or I saw one at this oil rig. But again, they're just kind of they're sporadic. And then Mexico Beach has been providing data. Again, they've given us 126 surveys since 2010, which has been great. So if anybody in here is interested in becoming more involved with that, I know that the state of Florida for sure would welcome the data. And then I just wanted to give a shout out to this new web module that the Gulf Council has created. I don't know if the link's going to work or not, but it's basically, you guys check it out at some point. You can click on it. You can go in there and you can give it to your constituents or your stakeholders, because they can now report where they see them, or they can report their interactions. So I call it a reporting device, but it's also kind of a complaining device, because people can call in. Now they can actually say, this Goliath took my fish and this is where it happened. So if you guys want to help out, it is a Sea Grant initiative, so contact your local Florida Sea Grant agent. There's a bunch of us in the room currently, and I'm happy to take any questions if I have any time. Okay.
What's the biggest one that you found?
The biggest fish that I personally have found, or the biggest one ever? I think that the record is probably, of course I'm going to forget the actual number, but it's between 700 and 800 pounds. For over 400 between 700 and 800 pounds. They can get up to 7.5 feet in total length. Our biggest one that we observed in our surveys was a little over 6.5 feet. We didn't weigh them, obviously, but and then the oldest one that they've aged was 37 years, but we think that they can likely live into their 50s.
Whenever the population has to become established again, do you think there'll ever be a special activity like take one a year or something?
So the
Marines during the summertime?
The question was whether or not there will ever be a sort of permit system in place or a tag system to allow people to harvest. Yeah. And actually they did discuss that. There was a FWC commission meeting on February 8th, so just a couple of weeks ago. And they talked about the potential of a limited scientific harvest and doing maybe just like what you're saying, a tag system to harvest. And they are incorporating public comment. They're going to have workshops over the next few months and potentially come up with some sort of a new strategy for state waters by the July meeting, I think is what they said. But, things move pretty slowly. And it would definitely be really limited if it occurs. I forgot to mention that, they're looked at as a value, as a fishery species potentially, but they've also done some economic impact analyses on the value of the fish alive to the dive industry. And apparently, the study showed that the value of the fish to the dive industry is almost double that to the fishing industry. So I don't know.
Are they edible?
They're really high in mercury, but anything at that size, if you fry it, I'm sure.
Yeah, I know you said on the big boy that you captured that you had to do some barotrauma, had suffered from barotrauma, and you had to vent him several times. Is that what you typically use, is venting to get them back down? And what is, you said, what did the data show as far as their survivability of that process?
Okay, so the question was whether venting was the best way to get them back down if they're suffering barotrauma, and also survivability after catch and release. So in our study, we did vent all of the fish that suffered barotrauma, and you can tell that they're suffering barotrauma because they usually evert their stomachs, and also then they float on the surface and they don't go down, so you can but venting them is a very, very good way to get them to go down. The only problem with Goliath Grouper is the fillet is like this, so you have to get through that to get to the swim bladder to actually puncture it and let some of that air out. And so a lot of fishermen, this is a great opportunity for education and outreach, because a lot of fishermen don't necessarily have a venting tool on their boat that's this long.
Yeah.
They have the little needles, which don't do any good. So you do catch a lot of Goliath that have like that Harry Potter scar from a Dexter Russell. You can tell like that's what happened, and they vented it and they heal. I'm not suggesting that as the best way to do it, but we've definitely have seen evidence of people venting them that way, because it's the only thing they have to actually puncture them and get them to go down. But we had no mortality in our study, but we did vent everybody. But we had no immediate mortality. Long-term effects of catch and release, we're still not sure. Was there a question in the back? Well, I mean, if you look in the literature, they were historically, every once in a while, somebody would report one, like off the Mississippi River or something. So I think maybe in the summertime, they've always used the northern Gulf, and then when the population was fished down, they just stopped seeing them up here. And now the population's coming back, so we're probably in. That's why I'm so interested in, if anyone dives up here in the winter, seeing if you see the Goliath. But once the water temperature gets down below a certain point, I think they're going to move deep or move down in the Gulf. But you're right about the mangrove habitat.
Have you seen any correlation between the number of lionfish on a reef and the number of resident Goliaths?
So the question was if there's correlation between number of Goliaths and number of lionfish. And unfortunately, I haven't, no. A lot of times the sites that have the most Goliath also have the most lionfish, because those lionfish like those artificial reefs too. So